You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
90% of retail transactions in Africa pass through informal market channels. Why do customers patronize these types of channels, even when they do have more modern retail channels available to them? Nollywood started as an informal industry and has now come to be well established all across Africa and all over the world. I would say the informal market may appear to the Western audience as being quite chaotic and unstructured because they don't understand what is behind the makeup of that market.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Dr. Uchenna Uzo, who is an author, teacher, Africa consultant, advisory board member, and marketing researcher. Welcome to the podcast, Uchenna. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Tessa. It's really an honor to be part of this podcast show today.
I've just actually finished reading your book. It's amazing. It's packed with some valuable insights, which I'm hoping we can discuss during our conversation today. Before we get started, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about who Uchenna is?
So Uchenna is the faculty director of Lagos Business School in Nigeria. He's also the academic director of Africa Retail Academy and a senior lecturer of marketing and also an Africa consumer consultant. So I wear different hats. My career has lasted for about 20 years now. And it's all focused around unpacking interesting and yet unknown phenomena about consumer and retail behavior in Africa. And it's really an exciting space to be in.
It is indeed. So thank you for the introduction and giving us an insight into who you are and what you do. So if we go into what you do, you recently published your book, Africa's Goldmine, a guide to winning customers in its unstructured market. What was the reason for writing the book and what areas of African customers did you focus on and why?
I wrote the book precisely because sitting here in Africa, I'm from Africa, I am also a customer, and I saw really how a lot of businesses, a lot of transactions, in fact, 90% of retail transactions in Africa pass through informal market channels. And for me, I found that really fascinating.
Indeed.
That the supposed unstructured or chaotic sales channel seems to be the mainstay of many economies in Africa. And that made me curious to try to understand, why do customers patronize these types of channels, even when they do have more modern retail channels available to them? The other striking thing for me was also that a lot of the routes to markets for making products and services available to customers go through the informal market. And so understanding how that route to market works and unlocking it was interesting for research, and we needed to pay close attention to. But to be honest, my curiosity market started with the Nigerian movie industry, where I started studying over 10 years ago.
Interesting.
My dissertation work was really on that. And that was my first take, because Nollywood started as an informal industry and has now come to be well established all across Africa and known all over the world. And it was from there I entered into retail to understand what was going on. So now, to the other question about the areas of the African customers that the book focuses on and why. I think it focuses more on purchase behavior, consumption behavior, of African customers, what is distinct, what is different, and what are those underlying factors that make them behave the way they do, as a background to understand what it takes to engage them effectively and orchestrate or design meaningful user experiences. It was more of teasing out the buying process, the buying patterns, the factors that make that happen in Africa, and what is unique and what is somewhat unconventional about them. And that is what the book focuses on.
Thank you for that, Uchenna. So you've given us a bit of detail in terms of the type of African customer that you decided to focus on. So if you look at the African customer from the perspective of, say, a business owner, what are your critical recommendations for companies that want to win the African customer? How do they go about devising strategies or techniques to access African customers from your perspective?
Okay, very good question. So I would first of all tell them not to see Africa as one market, or to see the African customer as one type of customer who has all the characteristics embedded within. Africa is very fragmented, but interestingly, there are some similar patterns we see in the region around consumption and purchase behavior that make it easier to understand how African customers behave. And I think that the first one is really what my research shows around bargain consciousness. A lot of the customers here, they want value for money. And because of that, they are very keen on getting the best deals, the best bargains. And so knowing how to price and set up products and services that feature the need to bargain is very, very, very important in the way that African customers traditionally behave. The other interesting thing about them is their highly aspirational nature. I mean, you would read in the book how you would find the average customer perhaps not even earning more than a few dollars a day at the moment, aspiring to live in the most expensive houses in 3 years' time and to drive a Rolls Royce and, to have the good things of life.
Yes, I understand.
And that is really surprising because we know how Africa is in terms of the state of infrastructure, state of development. But there's this belief, this hopeful, positive belief that people have in themselves and in faith that makes them to want to be highly aspirational. And then for that reason, they may aspire to have premium products and brands that are way above their income profiles just because it fits into where they would like to be. There's also the creative consumption of African customers, which really comes from, sometimes it's really because they want to be frugal. So they are using products and services in multiple ways so that those last for as long as possible. But we are seeing that is an interesting space that not too many people are looking at. We are seeing that it's not enough to just design a product and service in one expected way. African customers tend to find their own ways, be over and above how the manufacturers and producers envisage them to work on these products and services. And then there's the mobile first, approach, if I may call it that, of the African customers. The mobile channel, mobile tech, mobile phones is the single most important touch point. And it's interesting that these same customers who patronize the informal market channels, are very much on mobile at the same time. So that blend of brick and mortar versus tech, mobile or digital, is actually happening in an interesting way. So in terms of recommendations to these companies, is really about understanding how to segment from these customers who have these different characteristics, to have a clear engagement strategy to reach them, and not to assume that they are not sophisticated or they are not knowledgeable about global trends and global brands, but rather to have a clear approach to ensuring that we deliver personalized and unique experiences. And I think that is what would provide the advantage at the end of the day.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Uchenna. You touched on a key point at the beginning of your answer there, which was Africa is sometimes perceived as fragmented, but it's also diverse. But there are some similarities in consumer or customer behavior. Connected to that is that Africa's informal market is often described as chaotic and unstructured. How would you describe Africa's informal market and why?
Thank you. So you are right. It's often described as chaotic and unstructured, but I would say it has its own structure within this seemingly unstructured label. It's a structure that is fluid in the sense that a lot of the transactions that go on may not be formally written down because they are based on ties of friendship, of family, of people of the same ethnic affiliation. There is a lot of trust-based transactions that happen in that space. And for that reason, the informal markets don't tend to use, and this is what I saw in my research over this decade, they tend not to use written contracts to seal up transactions that they make. Transactions tend to be cash-based, even though that's changing a bit now with digital payments, but still predominantly cash-based.
Yes.
Pricing, you have price boundaries rather than very fixed price points. And that's because there's room for negotiation. And negotiation is actually part of enjoying a shopping experience. People want to have a conversation, they want to engage with the seller, but they want the best deal at the end of the day. And that price negotiation makes it possible. So in summary, I would say the informal market may appear to the Western audience as being quite chaotic and unstructured because they don't understand what is really, really behind the makeup of that market. But coming closer to it to understand its fluid nature, how it's built around these communal ties, may make it easier to understand why it has lasted for so long and doesn't appear to be going away. Because people value and appreciate some of the things that they take out from this market. And again, that is precisely why this informal market has ended up being the predominant route to market for making products and services visible, available, and accessible 24 hours a day.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. So you'd kind of emphasize the importance of the informal market within Africa and some of the details or nuances, such as it's a trust-based economy where transactions are done on trust. They don't tend to use written contracts. So if we can go in more detail in terms of, I guess, the interplay of economics, the state of supply chain, consumer preference, and I guess things such as local culture that drives Africa's informal market. I know that there's probably a lot to unpack there, but I was just wanting to go into a bit more detail regarding that in terms of the economics within the informal market, supply chains, which might drive consumer preferences, and also local cultures. How do they impact the informal market in Africa?
Okay, an interesting question. Well, first of all, in terms of the economic side, the informal market and especially the retail side, the informal market, is one of the largest employers of labor in Africa. And that is where the employable, in quotes, those who are employed in an employment after agriculture, that is where you find the largest share of people in employment, though kind of informally employed. And retail, this informal market is really the market that houses a lot of products and services that come from agriculture, from farming in different places. And so it's a clear route to market that is there. The other thing too that makes it very prevalent is just the fact that Africa is still moving in the direction of modernizing its infrastructure and improving its governance mechanisms. And so people have devised their own ways of creating their own markets, creating their own regulations and ways of doing business. And, from the supply chain perspective of things, this unstructured or informal market space still plays a very key role in driving supply chains across the continent. Of course, when things are not as organized as they should be, there is a cost side. It can actually end up being expensive. It is expensive to rely solely on distribution coming from these informal market spaces. But what organizations are increasingly doing is to fuse forms of technology and automation at different points in these different markets, to kind of reduce the cost of doing business in these places, and then to actually see if they can have layers of wholesalers, distributors, or franchises that have more formalized systems to work closely with those in the more unstructured settings. And I would say from the cultural side of things, it's more around, it's a space, this informal market is really a space for self-expression, where people, find their way into society. And it's really interesting also that a lot of the people who play in the informal market space have a leg in the formal market environment as well.
True.
So the boundaries are getting more and more blurred, even though we still see that the informal markets play a predominant role. So this diversity or this interplay of economic, supply chain, and cultural issues then affect consumer preferences, because what they want is, to be able to get products and services where they want it, when they want it, how they want it. And that's why they play between both, spaces. They play online, they buy on the go in the street, they buy in brick and mortar outlets and all that. So that interplay then becomes interesting and makes it more, I would say it makes marketers and salespeople to be more on their toes in terms of understanding what drives customers to switch from one channel to the other.
Fantastic. You touched on the informal market being a key route to market from sectors such as agriculture, the role it plays in driving supply chains, and the value it adds to Africa's economies. Frequently, we see businesses looking to, I describe it as trying to extract value from informal markets in Africa rather than adding value. How can businesses go beyond merely trying to engage with, say, African consumers to deliver value that meets their needs?
Excellent question. You're right. There's that emphasis on value extraction as opposed to value creation.
Yes.
And that really, in the end, hurts those businesses, because what we've come to see is that African consumers are actually global in their mindset. Thanks to technology, thanks to the internet, thanks to the mobile phone, they also know what is happening. They also recognize big brands. They also, want to be famous and to be known. They are like every other person in the world. There's an interesting study which showed that last year, of the 10 most loved brands amongst African customers, only one was actually a truly African brand. So the other 9 were global brands. Yeah, the Nikes, the Apples, and so on, were the most loved brands amongst Africans. And that just points to the fact that African customers know value when they see it. And they also see very easily when extraction is the purpose as opposed to creation. And therefore, the way to move away from the extractive mindset is to really look at the potential that the customer the African customer has to offer, the sheer volume, the young demographic, the size, the appetite, the energy, they may not be able to afford, but if you sachetize your products and services and offer the right value to them, they will buy. And value really means rich, customized, personalized experiences. Value means acting on feedback that customers give on time. Value means designing your route to market to ensure that you are there as quickly as possible for the customer. Value also means managing the aspirations, the aspirational value of the customers you serve. And value means being a business that values, that takes integrity seriously, walking your talk, being who you are. All these things are important things that the African customer is looking for. And that's basically how they define the value they want to see.
One of the points you mentioned there was that how value can be added by creating a personalized experience. I read a recent blog of yours that talks about experiential marketing and how it is failing to deliver the expected return on investment for African brands. Can you give us a brief overview of what experiential marketing is and why it isn't achieving comparable success in Africa?
Okay, thanks. So experiential marketing is really about designing marketing activities for customers that make it possible for them to interact with brands real time. So it's really orchestrating marketing activities that deliver an experience that enriches the exposure of customers to brands. Now, this is very different from just running an event or an activation, which we tend to see in some parts of Africa, with a short-term kind of mindset. And the reason why experiential marketing efforts sometimes don't succeed in Africa is because a couple of the people who run these activations have a try-and-see approach. They are not thinking long-term. The activation is just focused on customer acquisition without thinking closely about how to keep the customer loyal after that activation effort. And therefore, to begin to think differently or to do experiential marketing right in Africa requires really looking at the entire buying cycle and seeing where orchestrating interesting experiential moments can make it easier for the customer to decide to buy. And this would then mean really being close to the customer, aligning the experiential activations with other marketing activities that are carried out to keep the brand alive. It would also mean thinking more broadly about the lifetime value of each customer to be sure that that activation fits into their aspirations at the end of the day. And it will also require being mindful of the cost of running different experiential activities. So if brands, should we say, have a more strategic approach towards designing their experiential marketing activities, I think that in the end, it will then become as successful as it should.
So is experiential marketing, is it a new concept or is it an old concept or something that's being newly introduced within the African market?
It's not a new concept. It's been there. In fact, we have been doing our own experiential marketing in our own way with roadshows, people selling on the street, town criers and people like that. Word of mouth can actually be used to do experiential marketing. But what I think is new and interesting is the fusion of digital. There are now digital experiential marketing experiences like live commerce activities and connecting people who are on the ground with people who are mobile and sharing moments together. We saw that happening a lot at the time of COVID-19. The fusion of digital is really what has made it more interesting. But it's something that has existed. The only thing, though, is that it hasn't really been formalized. A lot of the people in experiential marketing agencies in some parts of Africa, we can't say they're under one umbrella guiding and supporting them. And so it's still in a process of evolution, I would say.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned how experiential marketing has been happening in Africa for years in our own, could be described as Afrocentric way, but developing and digitizing as it is across the globe. So, recently I interviewed Gigi Orcock, who mentioned African consumers are modernizing and not westernizing. So I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of what are some of the most notable changes in the behaviors of African customers that you've observed?
The first one is they are embracing technology a lot.
Fantastic.
Technology is becoming the tool or the engine or the vehicle for driving their aspirations. Everybody wants to have the latest mobile phone, to use the latest things, laptops and gadgets and so on and so forth, precisely because they see that as something that projects them into the future they would like to see about themselves. And that's something that is really a change. Another one coming from that is the growth or the rise in anonymous customer behavior. What that means is we are seeing more and more people who don't want their identities to be revealed in purchase transactions.
Okay.
Of course, in the crypto space, crypto payment space, now Africa is already leading in certain respects.
Yes.
At least if you look at the P2P crypto transactions. But really, it's interesting to see how increasingly there's anonymity is becoming something that is highly sought after. The other interesting one is the demand for personalization. In the past, social consumption was more of the thing you would see in a traditional African space. People want to consume together. Precisely, they also want people they use consumption moments to signal who they are and where they want to be. However, the interesting thing now is that while that social thing is not necessarily dying, people want their own personalized moments and experiences to go with that social part. And I think that's an interesting dynamic. The other one I see is really how they're using technology to, should we say, democratize marketing itself. So we're seeing a lot more of customer-to-customer buying and selling, customer-to-customer advertising using TikTok and other platforms. And that is interesting because if marketers, we who are in marketing, don't rethink our profession and how we should engage these types of sophisticated customers, we're likely to lose our jobs in the short term or even the medium term.
Thank you. So you detailed some of the most notable changes in behaviors of African customers, I guess, in the formal and informal markets. So customers are changing in the informal markets. Does that mean that the market itself is changing? Is the informal market adapting? Is it getting bigger? Is it getting smaller? Is it here to stay?
I think what we're seeing is that it's still here. I envisage that it's going to grow smaller, but it will morph. It will be more hybrid than really a case of being phased out completely, because technology, regulation, increasing exposure of African customers to global brands, and their needs for personalization will definitely affect the way informal markets behave and the way they manage the routes to market. But the interesting thing I see is that tech is actually not necessarily phasing out informal markets, but rather making it possible for them to modernize some of their systems and processes. So you are likely to have a blend of informality and modernization in that market as we proceed.
Do you believe there's a need to integrate Africa's offline and online retail channels in terms of technology, the informal sector and the formal sector?
Yes, I think that there's a need to do that, precisely because the retail channels are actually at the service of the customer at the end of the day, the African customer. And we're seeing that the African customer is not necessarily patronizing only informal markets.
Yes.
They are offline and online, and they want it to be that way. And so for any business that wants to thrive on the continent, you must have both a digital presence and an offline presence. Now, the integration is really about having an omni-channel mindset. What that means is rather than say, I must just have a digital and physical presence, is about saying which aspect of my marketing process should go on digital and which aspect should stay physical. Understanding which should stay where it is, and also using technology to make sure that both types of channels speak seamlessly to each other in a way that delights the customer is really where the trick is. Not everybody can do that. And it requires strategic thinking, investment in people, technology, consumer insights, but it's really the way to go. A good blend of offline and offline retail channels really can be a big advantage for ensuring that customers stay loyal to the brand.
So you mentioned there a good blend of, I guess, offline and online channels are the way forward to keep customers loyal. So in your opinion, what are some of the main micro and macro factors that influence Africa's informal markets?
Okay, let's start with the micro factors that influence the informal market. I think that the first one is really the fact that a lot of us in Africa grew up patronizing these informal markets, and they are the closest to us. They are always there in the neighborhood. They are there on the street. They are very accessible and visible, and products and services are made available. And so I would say precisely because consumers see them, demand for them, and also because they tend to offer those bargain opportunities, then that is, why this continues to thrive. Now, on the macro side of things, because of regulatory challenges, we wouldn't say that these markets have received the support that they need to modernize, in quotes. There are few African countries that have what you might call a national retail policy that is set up to really guide how these market transactions happen. And for that reason, people have gone about creating their own things. And therefore, the retail landscape is really another factor that is somehow macro, somehow micro at the end of the day. The fact that the retail profession itself, for that reason, is really not developed as it should, except in a place like South Africa where, you have more developed and formalized retail systems. In most other parts of Africa, retail is still, retail in terms of really formally understanding what it takes to closely engage the customer in the selling process is still at its nascent stage. And a lot of people doing retail, for them, it's not really a career. It's what you do when you don't have something else to do. And so there is a gap there that I would say I foresee that as more retail practitioners formalize and professionalize their practices, you are likely to see less informality in the markets of Africa.
So you've given us a great view of the current state of Africa's informal markets, detailing the main micro and macro factors that influence the market. So obviously, if we step away from the current state and look at, say, the future, as you are a marketing professional, how do you think the way that we market to Africa's informal customers will change, say, in the next 5 years?
So in my view, I think that the way we market to Africa's informal customers will evolve more in the direction of using technology a lot more, mobile technology. Now, 5G is coming into Africa. We are going to see that really improving or automating purchase touch points. And so we can't run away from technology. I think the transactions will be more cashless too. We're going to be moving more in that direction as the digital payments space gets better. But I also think that marketing is going to be a lot more experiential and personalized as we move on, because customers are going to want real experiences that match what they get from other global brands outside Africa. And so I would say that marketing to Africa's informal customer and even customers in the formal space, the difference between doing both is going to be more and more minimal as everybody moves towards really embracing technology and using that understanding of technology to improve the delivery of personalized experiences.
You've given a marvelous view of how we will market to Africa's customers as we embrace technology in terms of the informal market and formal markets will more or less come together and we will see almost a hybrid market. So if we look closer to home in terms of yourself, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? Do you see yourself publishing any more books?
Good question. Yes, I do. There's a book that will be coming out later in the year, towards the end of the year, about what it takes to scale and grow sustainable retail businesses in Africa, which I'm doing in collaboration with a couple of other people. So that's one to look out for.
Amazing.
Yeah. And I'm also part of the Africa Retail Academy, which is in the process of redefining the curricula for retail practitioners in Africa so that it's more suited and customized to fit the unstructured nature of our market. So one thing I'm really, really dreaming and looking forward to is being able to democratize that curriculum and really contribute to policy development across the continent that would make retail professionals find a home, find a future, see a career within retail, and contribute towards improving the way retail gets done so that it really has a meaningful impact on the lives of those involved in it.
Fantastic. So I'm actually really looking forward to reading your new book. And also really interested in terms of the work that you're planning or you're involved in terms of policy development for retail professionals in Africa. So that's all exciting. So I'll be keeping a close eye and close ear to the ground to see what develops.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, African proverbs, or even affirmations that keep us going when times are hard. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
Oh, yes, I do.
Fantastic.
There's one I have from my childhood always gone back to.
Brilliant.
That I would like to share. It's actually taken from the Bible, which says that those who are sowing in tears will sing when they reap. I think it's one that always inspires me. Those who are sowing in tears will sing when they reap.
Amen.
I think it's a quote to keep in mind, especially when one is going through hard times.
Amazing, amazing. That's a brilliant way to close today's conversation. Do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action to people who are listening to the podcast?
Yes. So I would say, the African customer is getting more powerful, more sophisticated, more demanding, more exposed to global brands. And so it's no longer business as usual for CEOs or marketers or business people looking into Africa. We can't have an extractive mentality anymore. We should have a more creative and service-based mentality. And so, this is a call for all business people looking to engage the African customer to be more strategic in their thinking, to take time to understand consumer insights, why people do what they do, and to design suitable routes to market that really fit into the more informal way of doing things that we see. And if this is done properly, it will help these practitioners or these business people to keep the customer lifetime value of the customer in mind. And I think that's what would deliver superior value in the long run.
That is a fantastic way to close today's episode of the podcast. Thank you, Dr. Uchenna Uzo. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. It's been a great conversation, amazing insights. I look forward to reading your latest blogs, seeing the next installments of your book, and keeping up to date with your endeavors.
Thank you. Thank you, Tessa. Thanks so much for this wonderful podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time, and I really do hope that our conversation today inspires other people to do a lot more in Africa, because the opportunities are immense. Thank you very much.
Look forward to speaking soon.
Same here. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.